All right. So now let's talk about rigids in a more abstract sense. I'm going to do that. I'm going to turn this back down to just maybe a few of these. It'll be faster. Whee. Cool. So, what are rigid bodies? Why are they even called that? Well, rigid bodies are kind of an abstraction of physics where we don't have to worry about the inside of the object. I mean, as we know with meshes, I mean, they're empty anyway. So here we are, inside of it. It's hollow, of course. What rigid bodies say is, hey, listen, we don't need to compute elasticity, like the way Jello would plop, or like a soft object would plop, stretchiness, the way cloth would, or even hair, cables. All of those things deform on a per point basis. Imagine a fold in cloth. This will never fold. Nothing like that will ever happen with rigids. They are an abstracted thing saying everything moves as one. Now, does that sound familiar? Because it should, because that's exactly what we said about what packed geometry is in the first place. Everything is considered one point. It has one point, it has one transform saying where it is and what orientation it is. So it's perfect, the perfect candidate for use with this, because not only do we get to take advantage of all that memory stuff I mentioned, but every point as it's moving through the simulation is still just one point. And we see the points for the ground plane also, but it still is just one point moving around, and that point has an orientation. And where that point goes is dependent on things like collisions, as we're seeing here. When this comes down, and I'll bring this guide back on, and actually, I'm going to bring the guide on and turn the inside geometry off, because again, this is really what we're simulating, are these things. So, all kinds of stuff is happening on every frame. It's just, in a way, Bullet, it should be considered a particle simulation, because again, each of these is just one point. That point is the centroid. So let's do a packed edit. Let's display these as centroids so you can see that. So now when we move them over, so there's our little centroid guys. Back in the simulation here, if I do display the geometry and I don't display this, and I'll even have this thing not be displayed, because who cares? This is what's happening. These points are moving on their own, or on the simulation. That's ultimately what the solver is calculating. It's calculating where these points are and what their orientation is. And that is, as you saw before, being stored in the primitive intrinsic. So rigids, again, don't deform. And when they spin, when they have a different orientation, they're oriented around that point. That point is what we would also refer to as the center of mass. So I'm going to bring this guy back on. So every time this thing moves, it's around its center. That center is going to store, in addition to the orientation, it's going to store how fast it's going, the velocity. It's going to store how it's spinning around itself, which is called the angular velocity. And it's also going to store things like how hard the collision was, which you could use for something. We can set things ourselves, like bounciness or friction. They're on here. They will affect how this moves too. If I were to move bounce, for example, down to 0, it's not going to go up nearly as much. See how it kind of just lands and falls over. I could put bounce at 1. Again, much like a particle system. See how they're bouncing now? Bing! Whee! Now, if this was rubber, it would be having internal oscillations. So this is just an approximation of how it would bounce. Because it is a rigid, nothing actually does deform. But anyway, so it's basically saying, hey, the incoming velocity is this hard. It's bouncing off something which also has its own bounce. And there's friction, which is reducing how it's moving. So if things are rolling, if you increase the friction quite a bit, they won't roll as far. So now it's having a war between, it still has a high bounce, but they're not getting very far. They won't move They won't slide along this surface. I'm going to keep the defaults here for now. All of these things are being stored on the points in the simulation. They didn't exist back here, of course. Nothing. But as you'll see in later lessons, we can actually define all of these things on a per object basis. For now, it's sufficient to show that if we open up the geometry spreadsheet, it has a different view in the simulation area, as opposed to, let's say, if we're out here, it looks like this is what you're used to. But in the simulation, it looks like this. If I go down to geometry, now we see that view that you're used to. And look at all these attributes we have now. Holy crap. All of these. We've got mass. So we've got mass, we've got the friction that we just talked about, we've got bounce. All of these things are being set here. So you can see as I play with this, those numbers are changing on there. So all of these can be set in advance back in SOPSland and read into this. And that can often be very useful, especially as we'll see later, if we want to animate what's active, or if it's animated based on some movement outside before it gets simulated. All kinds of crazy stuff will be changing on here later. The velocity is one that will be calculated as it goes along. As things bounce, right now when they're just falling due to gravity, v is straight negative. Once they start to hit the ground and move in other directions, you'll see the vx's and v's start to come online too. Now that is responsible for the overall translation of the object. There's also w, which is the angular velocity. It's how it's, you can think of it as when you deal with torque and things like that, it results in the angular velocity. It is how much it spins around. These are stored in Euler angles. So this is how many degrees in x, how many degrees in y, how many degrees in z is it spinning around that centroid point. So there's 0 here because they're not spinning. They're falling, which is why the v and y here is negative, but they're definitely not spinning. And it's not until they hit the ground that they spin. And why do they spin when they hit the ground? Well, that's purely because of the shape of our collision. If this is the ground plane here, just imagine how a thing would work in real life. It hits the ground. It can't keep going through the ground, but it still has momentum. So because it slopes away like that, it starts to roll that way. And that's, of course, our simulation doing that for us. So all kinds of stuff can happen. So we've got collisions can affect stuff. Forces like gravity are affecting what's going on. Even a force is modulated by how much mass it has. Objects can even, they'll inherit velocity or force from colliding into each other, like we saw when we had a bunch of them before. Those are basically, collisions in motion. We'll have constraints in this lesson a little bit later where an object will be attached to another object, at least temporarily, until maybe it breaks or something. And again, we ultimately just end up with a position, an orientation, a velocity maybe, and an angular velocity, and maybe some other geometry or some other attributes if we were getting fancy. But now comes the time where I do want to talk about matrices and how those affect the transformations.